This is Joe Schuldenrein, and I am going to be discussing the achievements and the objectives that we have undertaken on the Portalis project from the Irish side of the Irish Sea. The objectives of the project were to look at the origins of human immigration and human settlement of Ireland since its acknowledged beginning, which is at about 10,000 years ago. We were involved in the exploration of the landscape and to try to establish the chronology of human settlement in Ireland up since 10,000 years ago, and to see whether or not we can clarify what the glacial history of southeastern Ireland was once and for all. The Portalis project was exciting insofar as it brought in a series of fresh eyes to look not only at Ireland in terms of its natural landscape history, but also to establish some kind of a connection with landscapes that are similar across the Irish Sea and into Wales. And we had a team of geoarchaeologists and archaeologists working in Wales, as well as an independent group in Ireland itself. And what we did was a group of us from my company, Geoarchaeology Research Associates, came together with a team of Irish scholars, as well as my American colleague, Dr. Stanton Green, and we attempted to look at various perspectives on early settlement in Ireland in a limited area between Knockavillish Head and Creighton Head in the Waterford estuary. Now, estuaries are critical for looking at the connection between landscapes and human activity because they are the richest zones for natural resources that support life, both in terms of flora or vegetation and plant communities, and fauna, which is animal communities, and indirectly to the history of human occupation, because in the estuaries you would have a natural assimilation and accumulation of human groups, loci for human activity, because the natural resources included both salt water, which is a product of the sea and the estuary, and fresh water, which is the rivers that empty into the sea. And so what we do know is that as sea level rose over the past 10,000 years, the margin between the river zone and the sea zone tended to migrate inward, landward, so that as sea level rises, the available land diminishes in a landward direction, and the high productivity resource zone, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the saltwater area and the river area, that balance is the richest environmental zone that there is, and over time, that migrates in a landward direction. So that was one of the initial projects and problems that we were supposed to address. The second element of this is, how does glaciation factor into this? Well, over the course of our work, we discovered, I think relatively conclusively, that the last phase of glaciation, which, as I had mentioned, ended between 18 and 12,000 years ago, was in fact documented in the uplands of Ireland, of the Creighton Head and Knockavillish Head and Waterford estuary. In other words, they created a cove that was up to 5 to 7 meters above the estuary, and that is where the earliest evidence of human activity was located, and we're talking about the Mesolithic period. What we found was that, in fact, the Mesolithic settlement occupied the higher terrain. And the reasons for that was that as sea level continued to rise, it's very possible that people lived out on the coast when it was tens of kilometers to the east of where it is today. So what we're saying is that if there had been occupation during the early Mesolithic on the lower lying terrain, it would already be submerged by advancing sea level. Sea level rose approximately 6 meters, 6 to 8 meters over the course of those 12 to 10,000 years ago, which is when the approximate initial settlement of that area and of the island generally, when that began. Well, once we looked at the upper terrain at Knucklevillish and Cradenhead, we found that we were able to date those deposits, and those deposits came out to be associated with the latter glacial age. We got a date of approximately 29,500 years ago for that glacial deposit, which was glacial in every sense of the word in terms of the sediment that we found, and also was radiocarbon dated to that time frame. The Mesolithic is 12 to 10,000 years ago in terms of its initial settlement, and those deposits were very much surface deposits that were located on the high ground that had not been submerged during the sea level rise episode transition period during the early Holocene, which is the last period that we're currently in terms of geological time. 12 to 10,000 again is when it starts. And we know that beneath the surface deposit on the higher terrain, there would probably be nothing in terms of archaeology, and that was demonstrated by surveys that were conducted by Mark Zvelebil and Stan Green in the late 1980s. We were able to confirm that that model in terms of settlement, of the earliest settlement, was in fact the case. So that leaves us with the need to look on the lower lying terrain, or the present beach, between the two elevated landscapes, which are headlands, at Four Knot Strand. So we looked at an approximately 1.5 kilometer segment between the two headlands, and we noticed, and so had many other researchers prior to us, including Dr. Peter Woodman and Graham Warren and other well-known archaeologists of prehistoric Ireland. They had also known that in those years, in the years that they were doing the work, that the beaches themselves were lined with occupations that dated to, at the very earliest, to the Bronze Age and well into the Iron Age. About 4,000 years ago, there was an extensive settlement in the area of the contemporary beach. Our models of sea level rise indicated that by that time, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, the sea level was only within 1 meter of where it is today, so that because of wave action and the increasing storm activity that has been going on the beach lines, that they would variously expose artifacts and even structures of the Bronze to Iron Age, more specifically tilted towards the Iron Age, but very much so also in the area, in the time frame of the Bronze Age, which was also a period when people started to cluster together and to live in what would be roughly considered very, very early villages or concentrations of huts and structures in which people were able to utilize the resources of the estuary, which at that time was starting to stabilize as the rate of sea level slowed. So the estuaries were stable. People were concentrated in those areas because they understood that the salt and river components that created those rich biotic areas and vegetation and animal concentration zones were relatively stable, so that they concentrated their settlements in those areas so that they could exploit the incredible resources that were in that area and were effectively stabilized at that point. Having done that, we undertook a series of corings to identify and date as carefully as possible what the buried landscape looked like in those areas. And we were guided for that coring activity by remote sensing imagery from satellite data and from what's known as geographic information system models that took into account the elevation of the earliest contemporary landscaping operations to identify what the naked terrain for the past 10,000 years ago looked like. So we extended our coring investigations well into the tidal zone and very close to the marine margins beyond the tidal area. And we developed a series of coring transects that showed us how old the stable surfaces were underneath the contemporary beaches. We identified those. We identified forests. We were able to develop a model of how those changing forests, forests had changed as sea level rose. And there was a very strong transition from the early Mesolithic times. Again, no sites found, but the environments of that time frame were concentrated in coniferous forest profiles. In other words, these were cold climate forests that graded down towards the beach and were dated to approximately 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. And the forests were dominated by cold climate trees, spruces, pine trees, and only after 4,000 years, 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, did that vegetation change to a mixed deciduous seasonal forest that was associated with warmer climates. So as we moved into the terrain that was occupied by the later periods, by the late Bronze, by the Bronze and Iron Age, we had a change, a warming climate that promoted more villages and both clusters of houses and structures in what is now the beach. Everything to the east of that was, as I said earlier, now overrun by the waters that were encroaching landward. And so the only data that we could recover were radiocarbon dates from the eastern margins of the tidal zone that conformed to the time frame of the Mesolithic, but certainly did not give us any archaeological information, because all we're doing with cores is looking at environmental data, vegetation, and the like. So we were able to establish the margins of that, and based on that information, we constructed a sea level rise curve that showed rapid advances of the migrations of the marine transgression, or the invasion, essentially, of sea level into the landscape, up until about the Bronze Age. And that's where the archaeology basically is concentrated on the shoreline. So what the model showed us, and the two major issues that I think we were able to incorporate and to conclude based on our research, was that, in fact, the Mesolithic did concentrate, Mesolithic settlement in a map of contemporary landscape is concentrated on the headlands and on the glacial till terrain that extends well inland into County Waterford. And that is where there is a likelihood of Mesolithic artifacts that were initially identified by the systematic surveys of Green and Zvelebel in the 1980s, that the uplands could have had certainly indications of later occupation, but that the core or the basic settlement of what's now the coastal area of southeastern Ireland began in the Bronze to Iron Age. This is not to say that there aren't landscapes and human occupation centers well to the east, but that these are now submerged and are basically inaccessible for us. And that, combined with the fact that during the Mesolithic, population densities were considerably lower, the likelihood of finding Mesolithic settlements in the eastern part of the submerged part of the landscape is basically looking for a needle in a haystack, and only underwater archaeology would be able to recover that kind of information as you move eastward into the Irish area of the Irish Sea. The most important element of the archaeological record is now within the intertidal zone, where there's clearly evidence of early bronze through Iron Age and subsequent settlements all along the coast and well into the tidal zone. There's a rich archaeological record with diagnostic structures called phylacteries and structural elements of circular buildings and roasting areas and food processing areas from the early bronze well into the iron and subsequent periods. So our model, I think, is justified based on our coring activity, Mesolithic on the high ground, Mesolithic possibly well out into the continental shelf that's submerged currently, and intense evidence of human settlement for the Bronze into Iron Age areas in the contemporary foreshore and nearshore that we see right now on Fornot Beach, and well into the band that is called the intertidal zone. You are very likely to find rich archaeological records over there. Can that model be extended to other parts of the country? Absolutely. Now, the glacial record is somewhat complicated. The post-glacial record is somewhat complicated, but our research shows us that this type of model of human settlement, landscape change, climate change, obtains for very many parts of Ireland. It's not uniform because of the unusually unique glacial and post-glacial landscape change that's extends across the country. But that basic model applies for very many sections of the island, and we're pretty confident that that work that we undertook is a reasonable projection of how things were in the past and what our likelihood is of finding them. Thank you very much.